Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local independent community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour. We are on Jagera and Turrbal country here, and today on the show we're going to be talking about public transport. It's a big week for public transport in Brisbane and southeast Queensland, in fact, because on Monday will be the beginning of quite an extraordinary little government policy, which is flat 50-cent fares across the Translink network. You can go from any one part of, the southeast Queensland train, bus, ferry network to any other, and it will cost you 50 cents. And I'm very interested in this. I'm a big fan of public transport, even though I have to admit that probably like many of you, I very rarely use public transport. I love riding a bike and I live close in a city, and so I can get everywhere on a bicycle basically. But public transport is a really valuable thing for a lot of reasons. Of course, environmentally, there's immense benefits in a bunch of people all using the same transport instead of everybody powering their own car. And there's a lot of social reasons as well, both on an individual level and also about how we build a city and a community and things like that. And so we're going to explore all of them today. From lots of different angles, we're going to be exploring what this trial looks like and what is the value of it. So I spoke to Roman Gaffa from Translink to get some of just the basics about what the trial is going to look like. And then I spoke to Peter Allen from the Rail, Tram and Bus Union about how the union feels about it. I spoke to Michael Berkman, Greens MP for Maiwar, who, although he doesn't get to claim any official credit for this, which is the Labor government announced as one of their policies, presumably it had something to do with an upcoming election, but he certainly kind of fathered the idea when he was newly elected, when he suggested that public transport fares should be capped at $1. And at the time, nobody took him up on it. But now both parties have said that they support this trial, both major parties. And I also will speak to Kelly Bertolaccini. She is an academic from Griffith Uni about public transport. And so I wanted to get a lot of different views on it. And I think we really should try to take the best advantage of this opportunity that we can, because it's not just about Brisbane. Possibly there's a lot of places around Australia and the world looking at this and wondering how it will go and what it would mean for cities if you did just make public transport extremely affordable, what things would change. And so I think we should celebrate a bit of bravery from politicians to do something, radical and out of the norm, and celebrate the fact that we have public transport. Is pretty amazing, really. The fact that we live in this day and age where you can, get around places on buses and trains, and celebrate all the possibilities of what using shared resources could look like, instead of a world where everybody has their own car, has to maintain it themselves, pay for it, and then is each shut in their own little nuclear space. The idea that we can share things, and that maybe the world will be better off. And so I'm going to be trying to catch public transport much more over the next 6 months than I have been previously, and I encourage everybody else to as well. And of course, there's lots of wonderful places in our city and the surrounding areas that we don't necessarily go to, and this could be our chance to do it. So anyway, we've got a lot of different views on public transport, so I might get straight into it and we'll hear from Roman Gaffa.
My name's Roman Gaffa. I'm the Director of Events Scheduling and Busway Operations for Translink.
And it's a big week for Translink. On Monday, there will be probably the biggest change to Translink services in a long time with a change to the fare fees. What are these changes?
From Monday, all zones drop down to 50 cents as the fare. It's a great cost of living initiative by the government. What it does mean is it doesn't matter whether you're on the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, in the city, when you tap onto a bus or a tram or a train or a ferry, it's just going to cost you 50 cents.
So 50 cents total fare no matter how far you travel?
Yes, there is a sort of a way that the system works, no different to today. You can tap on and you get a 1 hour time limit between transfers. You get a maximum of 3 transfers per journey. You get a total journey length must be shorter than 6 hours, and your final trip must start with 3.5 hours of the first trip. So you can actually plan a great day out.
Now, there is some argument that you could just make the whole thing free and then you could dispense with all the go-kart infrastructure and everything like that and save some more money. Can you explain why it's been set at 50 cents?
Yeah, look, the 50 cent fare is required to provide us with valuable data. It helps us understand where services are busy, where they're needed, so that we can plan a reliable and efficient network. If it was free, you have no data, so you have no idea how to plan your network and meet customers' needs.
Yeah, and I guess that does bring up an important point, because let's assume that the demand for public transport is going to go up with these changes, and that in some places there's not many services at the moment. Is there plans to be changes to increase services in some areas if there's more people using public transport?
Yeah, look, at the moment we're running at about 87% of pre-COVID levels across southeast Queensland on buses, trains, trams and ferries. If an area starts to show an uptick and it gets past 100% of the pre-COVID levels, we would look at that area and do the planning required to put in more services if required.
But for now, you're just assuming that it will go back to that level of pre-COVID, which presumably you already have the capacity for?
Absolutely. The capacity is there, so that's what, the hope is that capacity builds back to those sort of levels.
So this is a dramatic change to the Translink services, and one that there hasn't been other kind of cities in Australia doing the same. I am interested to know what was the rationale of this decision.
Oh, look, the initiative is all about the cost of living and to assist people for a while and help them save some money. If I was travelling from Helensvale to Central Station, 8 times per week using a go-kart, I'm going to save over $2,000 through the trial. So it's putting money back in people's pockets.
But you work at Translink, and obviously you are connected to public transport systems and things like that. Do you think it's important to get people on public transport?
Absolutely. The more the better. You get people off the road, you get better control of the roads, less congestion. Really important. I think public transport is the way of the future, and it's here now and it's doing quite well. And I think it's important to grow that public transport network.
And are there other cities around the world that this has been kind of modelled on to have some idea of how it will go?
Not that we're aware of. My understanding at the moment is this is probably a first. So we've actually got quite a lot of Australia and parts of jurisdictions around the world watching this trial to see how it actually goes.
Which does bring us to an interesting point, because it has been said that it's just a 6-month trial. And so that will expire in February next year, I guess. And of course, there's an election between now and then. But it has been said that if it's a success, it might be made permanent. And so I guess the question is, what does a success look like?
success would look like being over the pre-COVID levels and increasing, less congestion. It's going to be one of those things to assess over time and see how it goes over the 6 months. I think, if people come to public transport, as we're hoping they do, I think that'll be a success. I mean, getting cars off the roads is a success, and putting money back in people's pockets as part of cost of living is a success as well.
So it does begin on Monday. I guess what's your message to the people of Brisbane with this 6-month opportunity?
Oh, look, take the opportunity, go and explore Queensland, Brisbane. You can go to the Bayside, take a trip to the Gold Coast, to the theme parks, spend a day at the beach on the Sunshine Coast, the Railway Museum. There's so many things you can go to. You could head out and see the music in the valley, catch the train at Woodridge Station, explore the global food markets at Logan, bus it to your favourite picnic park and have a picnic, head to Goma. There's so many opportunities. You can just get out and about for 50 cents. You can take the family out. It makes a good cheap day out.
All right, thanks very much, Roman.
No, pleasure, mate. Take care.
Roman Gaffa from Translink. And I also spoke to Peter Allen from the RTBU, Rail, Tram and Bus Union, to hear what the thoughts of the workers are on both this upcoming 6-month trial of 50-cent fares, but also of, the importance of public transport to a city.
My name is Peter Allen. I'm the Queensland State Secretary of the Rail, Tram and Bus Union.
And the workers in your union have a big week coming up with the changes to public transport fares in Queensland. I guess what's it been like in the union preparing for this?
There is a lot of work to consider. Of course, we know Queensland Rail, when we think of the rail side, have been, working across their operation, and that involves our members, whether they're people who are, driving trains, or they're working in the network control area, or they're working on stations. There's been a lot of work and consideration as to how to deal with the expected uplift in demand. And then when it comes to, Brisbane City Council for the buses, then there's also been, consideration about what that's going to look like. We think there's still a little bit of capacity in the system. We know that from, the trip figures. But nonetheless, we're pleased that government has been looking at, the rollout of additional buses to help with that increase in demand.
What's the general feeling around these changes for workers in the industry?
It's always going to be a bit of a mixture. There's always going to be the worry that, systems need to be able to sustain this increase. But I think overwhelmingly it's excitement that there's been this focus and, really a historic focus on, trying to get people to make that shift to public transport. And, it's under a bit of a microscope, isn't it? They're saying use it or lose it, so people really need to take advantage of this, both in terms of their normal trips to and from work, and that's obviously a big public transport task, but also in leisure time when people, have got this opportunity, for instance, if they live in Brisbane, to jump on a train and head down to the beach on the weekend and give it a try before they commit to doing it maybe during the week for commuting, but also to get the shops and to take other kinds of trips that people might otherwise have, jumped in their car. At 50 cents, you can afford to have a go and see if it works for you. And what we know is that when people give it a go, they inevitably stick with it. And these are our experiences from things like the Commonwealth Games and, when people go to these events, the sporting events where they get free, access to public transport. We know that there's a real bleed over, that people who give it a go for the first time are really tempted and, will make a plan to use that more regularly, and we think that's great. So our members are as excited as anybody to see this, because of course more people getting on public transport means job security. Let's call it for what it is. More jobs, better jobs, job security. If people are getting on trains, well then, and buses and trams, they need, people to service them.
Yeah, it's also a kind of collective action, I guess, public transport. Rather than everybody having to organise their own way to get from A to B, there's the idea that if we pool our resources, we can all do it simply and easily.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I think you're 100% right there. It is a form of sort of, collective action in a way. But it's also about maturity. Look at the cities around the world that have, got maybe... a longer history with public transport, than say we do for a variety of reasons. And, we see those cities that have faced the sorts of issues that, Brisbane and other cities, around Queensland have faced as well, in terms of, higher density and, this sort of urban infill and other things. And the natural next step is to move away from private transport to public transport, or at least to have a better mix of it. People might disagree, but there'd be a whole lot of people who live in and around London who would think you'd have rocks in your head for owning a car when there's such a good public transport system. In this case, we've got a great public transport system. It's clean and safe, and shortly, it's about to become ridiculously cheap. And that's something that we've called for, for much more affordable public transport, particularly for people who are on the outer extents of our network, so that they can, get to work and get to play, not only safe and cleanly, but also cheaply. We see this as a huge driver, excuse the pun, getting people out of their cars, so that they use them for what cars I think are kind of meant for, for longer trips where public transport just isn't going to get you there, longer family trips, maybe a holiday or something. But otherwise, we'd love it if people were just jumping on a bus or a train to do their shopping, to do their, for other leisure activities. Makes perfect sense to me, and it's what people around the world have come to terms with.
The announcement did sort of come out of the blue in some ways, but many of us assume there's a close relationship between unions and Labor government. So I wonder, did the union have much input into this before the announcement came out?
Yeah, we did. We certainly have been pushing this government to make public transport, more affordable, and we've worked with them on that. And I think we saw the first step of that, some years ago now, when that zonal system was initially sort of updated, if you like. So people in, the outer zones were all of a sudden in a much better position to be able to use public transport without the, horrendous sort of costs that were previously associated. And, we were really happy to be able to work with government to resolve that at the time. And then in the in-between, I guess, since then, some years ago, we've been pushing for a system which would allow people to take, better advantage of public transport. Initially, we'd been looking at more targeted assistance, but when government took the view that in fact, and considering the cost of living crisis going on at the moment, they could, they could take a broader approach to that with 50-cent fares, particularly given that they were able to leverage mining royalties to create the backbone of it. We thought that was a really good way to go. So yeah, we've been pushing for this sort of thing. We thought that this was pretty good. 50-cent fares make it affordable. Nearly everybody, and everybody who is in a more vulnerable position will generally get free public transport anyway. So we thought it was a fantastic outcome.
Are there concerns held by the union about the trial and how it might roll out?
No, look, I mean, if you're if you're a bit of a geek like me when it comes to public transport, you know that public transport is still about 13% across all modes, down from the pre-COVID peak. And most of the projections show that this trial would bring demand back to about pre-COVID levels, if not maybe a little higher, hopefully. And we know that the system can handle that. We're always concerned about the safety of our people. We've been very successful in getting a range of, I guess fairly technical fixes, which are often seen by way of screens for drivers and other sorts of safety fixes which are either in place or on the way. And those things are things that we work very hard on to make sure our members not only are in a safe position at work, a position of safety, but are also able to serve the public.
Well, do you have any final messages for Queenslanders as we enter this trial period?
Yeah, I do. Obviously, for people who are going to work or going to uni or going, to, a set piece sort of location, get on a bus or a train. Give it a go if you haven't already. But also give some consideration, particularly on the weekends when, trains aren't as busy as they are during the week. Think about this. If you're in Brisbane particularly, you get on a train and get off at one of the transfer stations and jump on the tram, go to the beach. I know it's winter, but you can go to the beach, sit in the, sit on the sand, read a book or jump in the water if you're brave. Go and have some lunch, have a drink. You can have a beer or a glass of wine or whatever you like, and then jump back on. You can have that trip to the beach. You'll get there to and from faster than you would if you were in the car. I can tell you that for a fact. You can have a drink, you can relax, and I would urge people to not only use it for work, but make sure you're using this to your advantage when it comes to your leisure time as well. Because I tell you, there's nothing better than don't put your feet on the seats, but sit back, read your book, and allow someone else to drive you wherever you're going, because I tell you what, it takes a lot of stress out of your day. So why not let our people do the driving? They'll get you there safe, fast and clean.
All right, thanks very much, Peter. We were chatting with Peter Allen from the RTBU about the view of workers about this 6-month trial. Like anything, it's a long process that's gone into the world we have today, and a lot of people doing a lot of hard work, sometimes courageous, sometimes dangerous, to try to get the world to where it is. And public transport, it didn't just come about, there was people demanding the right to mobility, and then of course the right to equal access to it, and all kinds of things that has meant that we have this wonderful public resource that we can all get around. And in Brisbane, in the next 6 months, it will be 50-cent flat fares from Monday onwards, and that is what we've been talking about. And I spoke to Michael Berkman from the Greens, because when I heard this policy, and I was very happy to hear it, I thought, wow, this is great. But I also thought, do the Greens get any credit? This has been their policy for, as long as they've been in the state parliament in Queensland. No, they didn't get any credit. That's not how politics works. But I thought I would speak to Michael about it, and about other things that we could maybe do around public transport to make our city better.
I'm Michael Berkman. I'm the Greens MP for the state seat of Maiwar, and also the spokesperson for transport here in Queensland.
And it is a big week for transport in Queensland, because on Monday the new fares change of flat 50-cent fares will come in. It's an interesting one, this one for the Greens, because it's long been a Greens policy of free public transport. So to start off with, what's your thoughts on this government announcement of this 6-month trial?
Yeah, look, it's obviously a welcome step in the right direction. It was back in 2017, actually, that we proposed a trial of dollar fares, because, the short version is we know that cheap fares not only help people deal with the cost of transport and the cost of living generally, but it increases uptake, which is an important way to deal with not just the environmental impacts of transport, but also with traffic and, the number of cars on the road. So yeah, it's a long held position. It's like seven years now since we announced the dollar fares proposal. But back in 2020, we suggested that it should just be free, because the government already subsidises public transport to a huge extent. The figure wobbles around a bit, but it's around 90% of the cost of public transport that's already subsidised by government. So what we're saying is that you really should just subsidise that next 10% and make it free, and that way you can avoid all of the additional cost of the ticketing system. Like the government's just spent around $400 million rolling out a privatised ticketing system, so they could lose that extra cost and all of the other costs of enforcement, like, you know, policing and security and all that sort of stuff. That, you know, if people are able to just hop on and off public transport, then there's no need for any of that expense, and so, you know, you're saving money at the same time as offering this really important public service for people for free.
The government have said that the 50-cent sort of nominal fare is to assist with getting data about where and when people are using public transport. Do you not think that's a valid reason?
No, look, it's not a nonsensical response from the government, but it's also not the only way to gather data. There are alternatives they could use, but I think maybe the main point here is that you know, they've focused on a 6-month trial. I'd have a little more time for that justification if they were looking at more than just 6 months, but instead it feels a little bit cynical to have dropped this as a 6-month trial that is then going to have to, after the election, by either an incoming LNP government, or if Labor manages to hold on, they've got to make a decision to implement this long term. But, you know, the cost of living crisis isn't going to be done in 6 months. People are still going to be struggling, and irrespective of that, all of the good reasons that this policy should be a permanent change will still remain. So yes, there's something in the fact that, you know, data is really important and helpful, you know, for planning the network and making sure that services are being expanded or made more frequent where they need to be. But there are a lot of services where we need those more frequent services or expanded services, and we know that without even needing the data. You can just see these big black holes across the city where there just aren't services available.
It's an interesting story about, I guess, the progression of political ideas. You mentioned that in 2017, when you were the sole Greens MP, that you brought this up as a policy. And nobody took it sort of seriously then, and now a few years later you're in a position where it's a bipartisan policy to have this 6-month trial. That's an interesting one for a party like the Greens, isn't it? About strategically, you know, how do you get political ideas out there, and how do they get implemented even if you don't have the political power to do it yourselves?
Yeah, it's a really interesting example of where, you know, the growing Greens vote in Queensland is kind of, you know, pushing Labor in the right direction. They're obviously, with announcements like this, trying to claw back some of the support by copying slightly out of date homework of ours, but nonetheless, you know, copying it. But, you know, we'd welcome Labor picking up any of the rest of our proposals, whether they're to deal with cost of living, like, you know, freezing and capping rents, or giving every child in the state a season of free community sport, or, you know, school breakfasts and lunches being universally available. You know, all of these are things where, you know, it makes no difference to me whether these announcements have got a Greens logo stamped on them when they're actually implemented. We just want to see better outcomes for Queensland. And look, I think the truth of it is that this is how you see political change happen oftentimes. Here in Queensland, we've got a particularly busted parliament and busted political system because of the kind of winner-takes-all approach. But seeing the way that we've been able to change the political conversation on issues like this, and so many others, you know, like it's fascinating to look at the way, you know, John O'Sharanganathan in council was years ago proposing that Victoria Park should close the golf course and turn it into public space, and he was laughed out of the chamber initially, and now it's an LNP Brisbane City Council that's in power to put that idea in place. So look, I want to see more of that, is the bottom line. You know, if we can move governments along, you know, by growing our vote, by growing these movements that we're seeking to represent in institutional politics, then all the better.
Considering this was your idea, did the state government consult you on it? Were you kept in the loop that they were thinking about it or anything like this?
No, I don't think it would matter if it was exactly the same policy we'd put out in 2017. They seem to go to great lengths to keep us out of the frame and pretend that we've got absolutely nothing to do with the decisions they're making at this point. But look, again, I think that's something that's likely to change in years to come. I think we're on a trajectory here in Queensland where power sharing will be increasingly common, where it's going to be more and more difficult for either of the major parties to form a majority government just because they don't have the support that they once had. So we're on the path to a situation where governments need to consult more directly, and I think more collaboration on policy and politics is only going to improve the state of politics here in Queensland.
Well, having gained some measure of success with your public transport policy, I guess then the question is, are there broader visions, specifically in public transport, of what else it could look like and other things that could be done that might be a Greens policy going forward?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, we don't think we're quite all the way with this yet. 50 cent fares is far better than they were because, of course, we have, still at this point, up until Monday next week, some of the most expensive public transport in the country, if not the world. But at the same time, we've got a really poor service. There was a recent report from the Climate Council that found Brisbane has the worst public transport access of all Australian capital cities. So there are obviously some areas where you've got good, frequent, reliable services, but the big things we're missing are things like intersuburban links, rather than this radial, in and out of the city kind of setup. Similar to the train lines, with a couple of exceptions like the Great Circle line, which is itself nowhere near frequent enough and really unreliable. But there are real highlights. If you look at the Southeast Busway, that's an extraordinary piece of infrastructure. We just need to see that duplicated. So I've been talking for a long while about how the Centenary motorway would benefit. So all of the western suburbs and the Centenary suburbs would benefit from a similar kind of busway out towards the western suburbs. But look, I think you could look at just about any suburb outside of sort of 3 or 4 kilometres of the city and find black spots where there just isn't a service. So more services, more frequent services, and, show up and get on kind of services is really what we need. We'll see, I think, some probably really worthwhile and significant improvements once the council's metro buses are up and going. But again, it's just not widely available enough across the city.
Neat. I guess some of those suburban areas, it's certainly not the normal cultural done thing to catch public transport, and people do have cars. Do you think that there's other things that need to go along with just providing services out there?
I think that's got to be the first thing that happens, is that the services are actually usable, reliable and frequent enough that people can plan their lives around it. Because you're right that we've got a deep, cultural affinity to being drivers, it seems. But I think, we often get this pushback from the department if we raise these issues of little black spots where we say this service needs to be more frequent, or you need to extend it to cover this area that currently doesn't have a bus service. They'll point to the fact that patronage on the existing service isn't high enough. And it's this absurd circular logic that says, we're not going to improve the services until more people use it, but no one's going to use it if you don't improve it. So I think that kind of the same sort of circularity applies to the cultural shift as well, Andy. We've got to make these services available. We've got to see proper, more fulsome investment in what really is an essential service. Not everyone has a car. Not everyone is able to drive, so we need to make sure that these services are universally available, and I think that's kind of a necessary precursor for the kind of cultural shift and to move away from car-centric planning. That's the other thing that I haven't said explicitly, is that we've got governments at certainly at both levels here in Brisbane City, with the council and the state government running an insanely car-centric agenda. Brisbane City Council have put active transport as a really low priority. The amount of money that the state's spending on active transport is kind of obscene when you look at it as a proportion of the total transport budget. There's plenty, like the cultural shift, I don't know that you can necessarily confect that or drive it in any more effective way than just properly funding and providing the services and infrastructure that people need.
All right, well, Queenslanders have a remarkable opportunity over the next 6 months that not many places around the world do have. What would be your message to Queenslanders as this trial kicks off?
Get on the bus. Catch your public transport. Like, I think that's one of the best things we can do to try and, lock in these services. If we've got people who wouldn't ordinarily catch the bus or the train, who use it while we've got this trial in place, that's the kind of information. Like, we'll be able to look back at the data over this 6-month trial, and even if it gets canned by government of whatever colour in 6 months' time, if we can look back at the data and say there was a massive spike in patronage, that's clearly what we need to do if we want to get people out of cars and onto public transport. That's the best ammunition we can have to continue to make this case to better invest in public transport and to make it free. So catch the bus, catch the train, anything you can do in the next 6 months to show that you value your public transport and you want to see it cost less or nothing.
All right, thanks very much, Michael.
No worries, Andy. Thanks, mate.
Here on 4ZZZ, the Paradigm Shift, we are talking about public transport. We were chatting with Michael Berkman, Greens MP, who has certainly been a great advocate of affordable and effective public transport, and I think will continue to be. Of course, the trial that we're about to begin is an amazing development, and it's one we're celebrating today on the show. I really wanted to do a show all about public transport to coincide with this trial. But of course, it is only a 6-month trial, and there'll be many, many needs in the future to improve our public transport system. The last interview I have today is with Kelly Bertolaccini. She is a public transport academic, and I did want to delve into a bit of just the purely philosophical side of why public transport is important, and not just important, but is great, is really wonderful. And so I got Kelly on the line. Let's have a listen.
Yeah, I'm Kelly Bertolaccini. I am a lecturer in transport engineering at Griffith. That falls underneath civil engineering. And I do a lot of research on universal design and equitable design of public transport systems.
And it is a big week this week for public transport in Queensland with the beginning of 50-cent fares. I guess to begin with, what are your thoughts on the 6-month trial we're about to begin?
I'm very curious to see what happens and how it ends up having that drastic price reduction, how it affects people's choices. But only, of course, because it's a 6-month trial, we'll see probably more limited effects than we would if it was, a longer term permanent thing, because a lot of people still live in areas that don't have great public transport. But I'm hoping they find some good stuff. And I also know that, immediately it will provide a lot of relief to people who are struggling with cost of living issues. So that's good.
Now, I have spoken to people that have different connection to the politics of this, or people that work in the railways, but I'm interested in you as a kind of theorist of public transport. I guess in discussing the value of public transport just from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, sure. I will say this is something I've kind of my philosophy on this is kind of organically developed, if you will, because I am an engineer by training, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. I think the biggest thing, and this might sound obvious, but public transport is a public good, and I would really like people to think of it that way. The reason I say that is there's been a big move, I feel like, in recent years from politicians. I probably tell from my accent from the U.S., since I'm thinking about the U.S. and Australia when I say these things, to treat it like it's something that needs to be profitable, as if its main purpose is to generate profit, and that's just really not the case. It's there because we need to make sure that everybody has some level of access some baseline level of access to goods and services. I think that's the main way I think about public transport. It's not something that, is intended to make us money. It's something that's intended to make sure everyone is able to access what they need. It's like trash collection or offering water to people's houses. It's something that needs to be done to make a city work. And everyone deserves the ability to access things, even if they, can't afford a very expensive vehicle like a car. And when we decide to focus all our energy and money on, planning for cars, that basically means people have to own this really expensive piece of property to be able to get around. And I just think that leads to all sorts of inequalities.
Of course, there's also significant environmental reasons why public transport is beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at, our transport sector is the second largest emitter in Australia of greenhouse gas emissions after the electricity generation sector, right? So it's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the reasons, when you start to break it down, it is the huge number of private vehicles that we have that are contributing kind of the bulk of these greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a need to get people to think about, switching modes. Now that will mean designing things differently, because right now so many people live so far away from reasonable public transport access. But I do think long term we have to reduce our usage of private vehicles, which means planning differently, which means better public transport. And that would lead to a really significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
You talked before about what makes a city, and I think one of the interesting things about public transport is that it's a public space, and you have this theory of kind of third spaces, how you build community, that you need things that aren't, work or home, where people can have incidental contact and things like that. It's in a place where, a city where things are getting more and more privatised. I think it's interesting to think about public transport in that way too.
Absolutely. I think it is so important that we do have these incidental contacts with others. I remember after the lockdown, the first lockdown from COVID in 2020, my first time riding a bus afterwards. And, it was kind of a thrill. I'm normally pretty introverted, but it was so great just to be around other people after so long isolated. And that's really changed the way I've thought about it. Like you said, it is a place where you run into neighbors who maybe you wouldn't normally run into, or groups of people you wouldn't normally see. So I think that is really critical. I also want to throw out there, when it comes to young people, particularly people under 18 or people who are too young to have licenses, it's also about access to other third spaces. I think a lot about, who is left out when we assume cars the only mode people are using to travel. And one of those groups is people who are too young to drive. And I don't know if there's been research on this in Australia, but there certainly has been in the US. But, there's a kind of they're calling it a loneliness epidemic among young people. And I think a big part of it is they can't get anywhere without driving to hang out with other young people. So I think obviously the space itself is important as a third space, but I think it's also critical, especially for young people or other people who can't drive for whatever reason, so they can get to other third spaces.
Well, the trial begins on Monday. I guess, do you have any message to people of Queensland presented with this opportunity?
Yeah, I would love to see people go out there and try it, especially if you're someone who has really stayed away from public transport because the price has been putting you off. I think this is a really great chance to give it a try. And I think you might be surprised that it actually works a bit better than you thought. I think a lot of people have this preconceived notion about public transport. And I think just giving it a try, and, if this trial's a success, hopefully it's something that could become potentially more permanent, which would lead to even bigger changes in terms of, people starting to really think about planning their lives around a different mode of transport, which I would love to see from both an environmental perspective and just kind of building community perspective. I think it's important to actually be out in your community if you want to be, connected to it. So, I guess that would be the main thing. Get out there, give it a try.
All right. Thanks very much, Kelly.
Thanks, Andy.
That is Kelly Bertolaccini there. Talking about the virtues of public transport, of which there are many and of which we will all get to enjoy over the next 6 months, with 50-cent fares on all public transport. What about the ferry? I haven't even talked about the ferry today. You know what? Brisbane has a beautiful river, Maiwar, our amazing scenic watercourse, and you can enjoy the views of it from a ferry, you know, while you get around. It's a lovely way to travel. And of course there is other infrastructure, public transport infrastructure being built at the moment as well, big projects, and it is important in the way we think about what it means to be a city, where everybody can get around and where we can have the ability to build community by being connected up to each other. And so I do encourage you to get out. Let's all celebrate on public transport. Let's just get out there and enjoy public transport for all it is, all its wonder, and, you know, talk to strangers on there. You never know. The person you're sitting next to could be a potential friend, or at least you could have an interesting conversation. There's so many possibilities. Get off at a random stop and walk around just to see a place you've never been before. All these things, they start to open up our world in a way that is not when we're just at home, or we're just, you know, in our car with our GPS directing us around. I think there's a lot of possibility, and we can imagine a very different world, right? And obviously, I'm not sure whether this trial will last. It would be wonderful if it does become a permanent thing. But in terms of just inserting little seeds of imagination, things like this are really valuable. That we've got this sort of Labor going into an election they're likely to lose, and just throwing random darts at policies on a wall and pulling one out. But actually, it is a really great opportunity for us to imagine a totally different city. And so let's do that. Let's all get on the bus, on the train, on the ferry. I'll see you out there. Get out to some great other events, political events that are happening, or gigs that you hear about here on 4ZZZ, local bands and things like that. Let's get out and about and see each other and make the most of this city that we live in and all the people around us.